well, nationalism certainly does help, I think, to make the Egyptians, for example, find what they want, but still, I wouldn't want to predict anything. No, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. It's what was your impression?
The big difference was, for example, when I met an older Egyptian, I would ask him where I come from or where are you from. He said, I'm from Aswan, or he would talk about his tribe or the family or whatsoever. The younger Egyptians say, I'm Egyptian. That's the big difference. And I think that's the main process we see, this liberation from. Let's take Libya. Libya, of course, is seen, thanks to Orientalism, is seen as an Arab dictatorship, but actually it's just an installment of Europeans that put this regime there to keep their interests. You know? And how would you say, and how far those revolutions now process that get rid of those, I would say, needles in the flesh?
Well, I guess with view to the past few decades, there are several important things to refer to. One is your state, and I think Egyptians are pretty proud of being Egyptian, but of course tribes still play a major role as well, even in Egypt, I guess. So it's hard to say whether it helps or it doesn't help, but I think being Egyptian certainly maybe even plays a bigger role after the revolution, because people are so proud of having achieved something. That's what I feel as well. But it helps to establish something new. I'm not sure.
Interesting.
Can I two questions? One is an evaluation. Maybe the difference between the Egyptian and Tunisian model and the Jordanian, Moroccan, all the way to the Gulf kind of model. So the distinction between the republics and the monarchies is not so much that in the republics there is a questioning of the presidency and a request for Hal, for people to go, and that there isn't in the monarchies, but that that there is a length of time that needs to go from making the first request for the system to change in general, greater social economic justice, greater political representation, and then when those demands are not met, as they were not in Tunisia and Egypt, then the program radicalizes. And in a sense that fits with what's been happening in Bahrain, and even in Morocco, although we've heard a lot less than that about that, because in Bahrain, if you recall, the initial demands were for reform, for greater representation. They weren't, as some people ask now, for the ruling family to go. So maybe there's a difference of timing, sort of rapidity of the process rather than the nature of the process itself. But the other thing is, I think, the preceding question is really a good one in the sense that it invites us to change a little bit the focus that we've had until now. And I think that if we look at Egypt and Tunisia, one of the things that really stands out to me about both the revolutionary phase, in the sense of the toppling of the regime phase, which is the first step in the sense of the revolution, and the period after it, is how much pressure has been sustained on the regime, elements of the old regime that remain in power in both cases. And that pressure has actually come mostly from quarters that we haven't expected it to come from. In Egypt, for example, the labor movement. Everyone's talking about April 6th and so on, and there's a considerable overlap between April 6th and civil society and the labor movement. But it's the labor movement that is in the streets and the squares of Egypt, putting pressure on the regime all the way from Alexandria to Mahava, Menfia to Port Said, Ismailia, Cairo, and so on. So maybe we need to be looking at the major difference between all the cases that we mentioned is not so much whether they're modern or pre-modern or ultra-modern, what kind of levels of socio-economic development there are, but in a sense, the degree of pluralism that there already is, not pluralism, but spaces that can be carved out illegally against the regime and so on. Spaces that can be carved out in those cases, and maybe that helps us understand why certain cases have a kind of faster progression to one element, and understand the falsification in some cases around the world.
Yeah, I like that image. I think and that partly explains maybe why Syria is not getting anywhere at the moment. Yeah.
There was one more question here. Yes.
It's more like a historical question. I actually agree very much with this estimate that there is a fundamental difference between the republics and the monarchies here. That makes a lot of sense to me. My question concerns the republics themselves. So obviously, two of them have fallen, and even if in Libya Gaddafi can keep his power, he can only keep it at the price of becoming an international pariah again. So these republican systems in the Arab world proved to be spectacular failures. If you just look at their trajectory, when Nasser began this whole model, and for a good length of time he was a matter of Arab pride. He was credited with restoring Arab pride, and that evaporated completely. And for at least 20, 30 years, these systems have been seen, even by their own populations, as massive failures. Why did they fail so spectacularly? Why don't you find any popular, any successful model there? Syria, Libya, even Algeria, these are not successful regimes. What's the reason behind it? Is it because they were nationalists in the wrong sense and they didn't find a way to reconcile that with Arab identity in a proper way? Or is it because they were experimenting in socialism and didn't find an ideological way out? So where did they lose their dynamism? Where did they become so oppressive and rigid?
Well, I think you mentioned two things that certainly, or in my opinion, didn't help. Experimenting with, socialist experiments. On the other hand, the fact that there is a monarchical tradition, then there suddenly were republics. But I think even the population was at least at times not that opposed to the idea of installing like a ruling family again. And I think there are many factors, but I think the two you mentioned certainly didn't help. I don't really think this society, after republics were installed, I don't really think it was a change for this society in any way, and that sort of made it easier for the ruling presidents to do what they want in a way, or for the ruling elite. And when they started doing that, after a while it becomes easier and easier to do what you want. I guess that helped. But that's not a full explanation, I know, but...
We soon have to draw to a close, but I see two questions here. It's another one from Andrea and from the lady in the... Yes. Do you want to start?
Just more of a comment on the last comment, just to say, I don't know that we should call the nationalism that swept through Egypt with Nasser to be something so great or so dynamic, I think was the word you used, and that its failure had brought oppressive regimes. I think that under Nasser there was already an oppressive regime. Nationalism had already turned what was once a very cosmopolitan Egypt under the oppressive regime of Britain. But it's not such an easy black and white, is what I'm trying to say. That certainly under Nasser, there were the whole Muslim Brotherhood and the vacuum of power that happened there at the end of the British Empire's presence. That the Muslim Brotherhood and that kind of Arabic identity which became fixed, sedimented, identified, given a face, given a sex. This is not necessarily dynamic history or dynamic or emancipatory part of Egypt's history. So that's so much. Also, Tunisia and Egypt. You were saying how no Iranian would want to be called Arabic. Tunisia also has a difference there. Their Arabic, their language, they will insist is not understood